I was 8 years old the first time Mama locked me in the chicken coop for the night. No warning, no goodbye, just the cold scrape of the latch. I slept beside the hens while our house, my house, glowed warm without me. And I stayed out there for 9 years. You know, some mornings I wake up with the strangest memories curled up next to me, like an old cat that just won't leave the porch. Today, it was the smell of damp feathers. Funny how a scent can drag you 40, 50, 60 years back, like it was just yesterday. I was sitting out back with a cup of sweet coffee, not too strong, just how I like it, and the breeze carried that smell. Wet straw, chicken dust, a little hint of rust. And right then, I remembered the coop. Lord have mercy, that old chicken coop. I hadn't thought about it in a long while, not really. Not the way it felt. And baby, let me tell you, some places, they don't just live in your memory. They nest in your bones. Now I know this might sound mighty strange to you, but there's a story behind that smell. A story I don't tell just anyone. But maybe it's time. You're here, and I reckon if you're still listening, you might want to sit a spell. Make yourself comfortable. This ain't no bedtime tale, sugar. This is the kind of story that gets under your skin a little. But don't worry, I've lived through it, and I got out with my heart still beating. And, before I go any further, let me just say, if you're the kind of soul who finds comfort in folks being honest with you, why not tap that little OL heart down there? You know the one. Give this story a like, so it finds its way to someone who maybe needs it. And if something stirs inside you, well, leave a comment. I read every single one, even the ones that make me tear up a bit. Ain't nothing wrong with a good cry now and then. Anyway, I suppose I ought to introduce myself proper. My name's Grace Eleanor Macaulay, though most folks round here just call me Miss Grace. I'm 78 years old. I live in a plain white house on the edge of a town that ain't on most maps anymore, and I plant tomatoes every spring like clockwork. I got a little dog named Rexy, a daughter who teaches 2nd grade, and 2 grandbabies who think I hung the moon. But back then, the time I'm about to tell you about, I was just a girl. A thin, sharp-boned little thing with quiet feet and calloused hands. And I lived on a patch of dirt in Saline Township, Arkansas. Lord, those were hard years. Dusty roads, long shadows, and folks who didn't say much unless it needed saying. My mama, Ethel Rose, was one of them. She was a hard woman. Not mean, exactly. Just closed up. Like a door that never got used no more. Her voice was always soft but tight, like a bedsheet pulled too tight across a mattress. My daddy, well, he was gone before I took my first breath, and Mama never spoke his name. Said he left a hole in her life that no child could fill. And I guess, in her mind, I was the reason for that hole. So, she made sure I knew where I stood. Outside. Always outside. And that's where the coop comes in. You see, when I was 8 years old, she told me I couldn't stay in the house no more. Didn't shout, didn't cry. Just handed me a blanket, opened the back door, and pointed. No words. Just that finger. Toward the chicken coop. And I went. Didn't argue, didn't ask. That's how things were. You didn't question grown folks back then, not in Arkansas. Not when you were raised on silence and stale cornbread. So I slept with the hens that night. And the next. And the next. Until I was 17. Now, I ain't telling you this for pity. Lord knows I don't need that. I'm telling it 'cause sometimes stories need breathin' room. They sit inside us, folded tight like a letter no one ever reads, and then one day, the breeze smells like feathers and sawdust, and suddenly, you're right back in it. You're 8 years old again, listening to the low cluckin' of hens and the wind rattlin' the slats of a crooked old coop. You're wondering if maybe, just maybe, you'll ever be let back inside. So stay with me a while. Let me tell you what the chickens taught me. About silence. About strength. About the way some wounds scab over in the dark and others keep us in for years. And when I'm done, Maybe you'll see why I never once raised my voice to my daughter. Why I never turned away a stray. Not even a cat. Because even a chicken's got a place to roost. But let me ask you something. Have you ever been made to sleep where no child should? Have you ever had to earn your way back into someone's heart, even when you were never the one who broke it? Go on. Tell me in the comments. Or maybe just whisper it to yourself tonight. Either way, I'll be right here. I was 8 years old when the summer sun would rise over Saline Township like a golden promise, casting long shadows across the dusty road that led to our little white farmhouse with the peeling paint and tin roof that rattled whenever the wind rustled the pines. And I remember carrying my wooden bucket to the well before dawn, humming hymns from Sunday school while the roosters crowed and the horizon glowed pink and orange. Back then, mornings smelled of fresh dew on tomato plants and the sour tang of sourwood honey dripped by Miss Ida next door, and every neighbor seemed a world away, with fields of cotton and corn stretching like an ocean between us, broken only by the gravel lane where Mama's tired Chevrolet sat, engine cold, waiting to carry her off to town on business she never discussed. I was that quiet little girl with hair in 2 braids, knees always scuffed from chasing chickens through the yard, and I believed with all my heart that kindness was the greatest gift you could offer, convinced that folks always came back around when you treated them right, because that's what Mama taught me before she shut her door on me. Sunday afternoons were for church, white clapboards and stained glass windows, the choir singing Amazing Grace, so sweet it felt like it might lift you off your pew, and afterwards the long ride home in silence, Mama's gloved hand on the wheel and me staring out at the fields, dreaming of a world where laughter filled the porch instead of the low hum of worry. My dreams then were simple: a new dress for Easter, a book of fairy tales from the traveling salesman, the hope that Daddy might stride out of the horizon one day and scoop me up in his arms, whispering that everything would be all right. I spent my afternoons reading by the window under a patched quilt, the wind flirting with the curtains, my heart fluttering at stories of princesses and far-off kingdoms, convinced that one day I'd step out of that chicken yard and into a life brimming with love and adventure. The rhythms of our farm life were steady, milking the cow before sunrise, helping Mama bake cornbread in the wood stove oven, tending to the garden rose that she insisted would teach me patience. But there was an ache beneath it all, a silent gap where tenderness should have been, and though I didn't understand it then, I felt it in the way Mama never looked me in the eye, in the way she spoke of me almost as if I were someone else's child. I once confided to Miss Betty, who lived 2 farms down and wore her hair in a chignon of grace, that I thought I must have done something awful to deserve such quiet punishment, and she simply draped her shawl around my shoulders and said, "Child, you're worth 1,000,000 morning suns, don't you forget that," and for a moment I believed her. But every night when the moon rose heavy and silver, I'd curl up under that scratchy blanket in the coop, surrounded by the soft cluck of hens settling in, and wonder if anyone in the whole wide world was thinking of me, or if my only companions were the feathers drifting through the slats. I thought there, in that dusty coop, that maybe kindness was a promise that only lived in books, not in the real world where you could be left out in the cold without a word. And yet, even in that dark place, I dreamed of sunrise and people who kept their promises, because a little spark of hope can't be snuffed out that easily. I was 13 when something shifted in that dusty old world of mine, a crisp autumn morning when the leaves turned to fire before they tumbled down the lane, and I was hunched over the chicken coop, gathering eggs before school. That's when I first saw him, Tommy Jenkins, whose family had moved onto the Johnson farm at the edge of Saline Township. He wasn't much older than me, a lanky boy with a crooked grin and a stack of dog-eared books tucked under his arm. He paused where the sun dappled the fence posts, watching me with curious, earnest eyes, and for the first time in years I felt a flicker of something besides fear or loneliness. He tipped his hat, an old straw fedora a touch too big, and said in a gentle drawl, "Morning, Grace Eleanor." I froze, half afraid I'd been caught where I didn't belong, but he only held out one of those books, a battered copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. "Thought you might like to read something besides the school primers," he whispered, voice soft like church choir harmonies. My heart thumped so loud I swore the hens stopped clucking just to listen. I took that book as if it were the finest gift, thumbed the pages, and saw a note tucked inside. "You are braver than you know." I didn't know then who wrote it. I only knew my world, filled with straw and silence, had cracked open just enough for a sliver of hope to shine through. That moment was the spark that set the rest of my story ablaze. In the days that followed, Tommy became the secret soundtrack to my life. He'd meet me by the old oak tree after supper, his eyes bright with mischief and kindness, and he'd read aloud from Dickens or Twain while I leaned against the tree's rough bark, my blanket draped around my shoulders to ward off the chill. I remember sitting there, listening to him turn pages and thinking, land sakes, I never knew a story could feel like home. With every whispered line, I felt my chest swell, alive in a way the chicken coop never allowed. For the first time, I dared to imagine a life beyond that rickety farm, a world where I wasn't just the girl who slept with hens, but someone who belonged. My stomach would twist into knots when his gaze met mine, and I'd blush so fierce I could have lit up the whole county. I'd carry his notes tucked in my dress pocket, little reminders that someone saw me, truly saw me, washing over me with warmth on those nights I spent alone in that coop. And though Mama never spoke a word about it, I felt her eyes linger on me more softly, as if she sensed the change unfolding in her silent child. That unexpected friendship, with its laughter, its shared secrets, its quiet encouragement, did more than lift my spirits. It taught me that love, in its gentlest form, can break through the hardest places. It showed me I had a voice worth hearing, a heart that could hope, and a future waiting just beyond the next sunrise. And baby, let me tell you, that first tremor of something like love was the very thing that started me down the road to finding my own worth, and eventually, to finding my way back into the light. I remember the first time Mama got wind of my little treasure trove of books hidden in the hayloft above the coop. I'd been reading by lantern light after the hens had gone silent, each page a ticket out of that dusty world, and I could almost taste the words on my tongue when Mama's voice cut through the night like a shard of glass. She stood at the bottom of the ladder, arms folded, shadows stretching long in the flickering light. I froze, clutching my precious copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the paper soft beneath my fingertips. There was no anger in her voice, just that cold, unyielding quiet, as she told me books were for civilized folk, not barnyard birds. My heart hurt, not just because she'd taken my book, but because she'd stolen my hope. From that night on, the routine shifted. Instead of birdsong waking me, it was fear. Fear of punishment stronger than any writ of law. Fear that my secret would cost me the only friend I'd ever known. Mama began to place chairs in the doorway of the coop, so I could hear her pacing across the wooden floorboards, the floorboard creaking under her worn boots, reminding me that I was small and powerless. I tried to steel myself, but each creak sounded like a judgment, each footfall a reminder that I belonged outside, always outside. And when I dared to smile at Tommy Jenkins across the fields, Mama's glare followed me like a shadow thicker than the night itself. "Keep your head down, girl," she'd say, her voice soft but steely, like a scythe slicing through wheat. I learned to nod and walk on, cheeks burning, humiliation pooling in my chest. Inside me, a storm brewed, anger that I couldn't speak up, shame that I'd let her treat me like a stray animal, and sorrow for the little girl who believed kindness was the world's greatest treasure. Miss Betty tried to help, bless her heart. One afternoon, I found a small parcel on the porch, a worn copy of Heidi wrapped in brown paper, a note pinned to it, "For brighter days." My eyes filled with tears as I cupped that book to my chest, but Mama saw it too. She ripped the pages free and tossed them into the fire pit, the paper curling into ash while my dreams turned to smoke. In that moment, I felt the first sharp edge of despair. The world I'd escaped into was burning, and I had nowhere left to hide. Yet I could not forget Tommy's parting words, written on a scrap of notebook. "You are braver than you know." Those words pulsed in my veins like a rallying cry, a fragile lifeline I dared not let slip through my fingers. The conflict turned harsher when the preacher's family moved into the house next door. Sunday mornings, their children would sprint across the yard, laughing and shouting, their voices reaching me through the slats of the coop. I'd press my face to the wooden boards, longing to run with them, to feel a hand curl around mine. Instead, Mama forbade me from speaking to strangers, from even glancing their way. Every time I heard their laughter, my chest tightened with a mix of envy and grief. I began to doubt myself. Was I the one at fault? Had I done something wrong that deserved this punishment? Shame settled in my bones, whispering that maybe I was unworthy of kindness, unworthy of love. Inside, I wrestled with a cruel dilemma: obey Mama and bury my dreams, or risk her wrath for a fleeting moment of warmth. Each morning, as I hauled water for the hens, I prayed for courage. But courage was in short supply when faced with Mama's silent authority. I saw how she flinched whenever I looked at the horizon, as if afraid I'd flee for good. And perhaps I would have, if not for the memory of Tommy's gentle smile and the hope that kindness might one day find its way back to me. So I stayed, trading scraps of my heart for the chance to learn what survival truly meant. I learned that sometimes the hardest battles are fought in the quietest places, and the fiercest courage blooms in a heart bent but unbroken. I remember that day like it was carved into my very soul, the air heavy with the scent of rain yet holding its breath before the storm. I was 16, standing in the pale light of dusk just beyond the chicken coop, when Mama's whisper sliced through the quiet, "Pack your things. You're leaving tonight." My heart lurched as if someone had yanked it free, and I could feel the world tilt beneath my feet. I had spent 9 long years sleeping on straw and feathers, learning to keep my head low so the hurt wouldn't find my eyes, and in that moment I thought I would collapse, my legs trembling like the branches overhead. But the words didn't come gentle. They carried the weight of something darker than punishment. She didn't say where I'd go or why. She let the silence swell until it pushed me to the breaking point. I stood there, clutching the handle of my battered suitcase, its leather cracked and scuffed from every mile I'd ever dreamed of traveling, while thunder rolled in the distance, as though the sky itself was mourning my fate. And then she did it. She handed me a crumpled piece of paper with a single line written in her neat, precise hand: "You're no longer my daughter." Time halted in that instant. The crickets stilled, the hens ceased their low clucks, and all I could hear was the rugged thumping of my own heart. In that suspended breath, I understood the depth of her conviction, that I was less than family, that I was an embarrassment to be cast off like yesterday's newspaper. Shock twisted my stomach into knots so tight I thought I might never breathe again. I stared at her, searching for a flicker of mercy in her eyes, but found only ice. The sky wept first, a single drop of rain landing on my cheek, mingling with the tears that finally escaped. In that moment, I didn't just lose my home, I lost the only person who had ever claimed me, however cruelly. The weight of her words sank into my bones, and I realized that whatever hope I'd held for her love was now gone for good. I lost my childhood in that breath, the dreams of a normal life, of gentle words, of a mother's embrace, and instead I gained a burning ember of resolve here, in the pit of my chest. I closed my eyes and let the tears fall, each one marking the end of everything I had known. When I opened them, I felt the first stirrings of something fierce and vital, a determination not to let her define me any longer. My hands unclenched from the suitcase handle, and I stepped forward into the gathering rain, the sky finally releasing its grief as the thunder broke overhead. I never looked back at the coop or Mama's silhouette in the doorway. In that turning point, I shed the last shred of fear and became someone new, someone who would build her own life from the ashes of that broken home. That night, I walked barefoot across the wet fields, letting the cold mud press into my feet and the storm wash over me, baptizing me in sorrow and strength. I understood, in a way I never had before, that true freedom often comes at the cost of a shattered past. And as I crested the hill and saw the lights of Saline Township twinkling like distant promises, I whispered into the wind, "I won't be broken." The world felt at once vast and alive, and I knew that my story was no longer bound by the coops and shadows of my childhood, but by the boundless horizon that lay ahead. I stepped away from Saline Township under a pale dawn sky, my heart hollow as the fields I left behind, and for a long time there was only silence in my life. No more roosters, no more creaking coop doors, just the endless hum of my own thoughts rolling like thunder in my chest. I took to riding freight cars westward, gripping the cold metal rails with numb fingers, each mile carrying me farther from the girl I used to be. Nights were the hardest, sleeping under railroad bridges or in abandoned barns, wrapped in the same threadbare blanket that had once kept me warm among the hens. I learned to measure safety not by kindness, but by the absence of violence. No one shoved me, no one snarled, and that felt like mercy. My faith in people, once a bright ember fanned by Tommy's gentle voice and Miss Betty's quiet compassion, flickered low, as if the wind had blown it nearly out. I began to believe that hope was a luxury I couldn't afford, that trusting another soul only set you up for grief. The world felt vast and indifferent, a place where a girl could vanish without a trace and no one would even pause their Sunday drive to wonder where she'd gone. In those empty stretches between towns, I learned self-reliance the hard way, finding work in dusty diners for scraps to eat, washing dishes until my hands cracked from the grease and cold water, sleeping on linoleum floors and praying that the morning would bring something better. Some days, I sat by the highway, thumb out and tattered suitcase at my feet, too ashamed to flinch when cars slowed, but didn't stop, reminding me that everyone had somewhere they belonged except me. The loneliness was a living thing, pressing against my ribs, whispering that perhaps Mama had been right, that I was meant to be alone. But then, in a moment so small it felt miraculous, a stranger, an old trucker named Hank, saw me shivering by the roadside and offered me a ride and a peanut butter sandwich. He didn't ask my name. He didn't ask my story. He just handed me that sandwich and a thermos of coffee and drove me to the next town. That simple act cracked open something inside of me. The belief that even in a world of broken promises, unexpected kindness could still bloom. And so, piece by piece, I began to stitch my faith back together, though it was a ragged quilt compared to the one I'd lost in the coop. I found work at a lumber mill, my muscles growing strong from lifting boards and learning that physical labor could quiet the storm in my mind. I wrote letters to Miss Betty, never to Mama, and tucked my words between the lines, confessing my fears, my regrets, my quiet gratitude for the small mercies I'd been granted. I learned to cook anew in a cramped apartment with an electric stove, measuring out flour and sugar as though I were baking hope itself, letting the smell of cornbread remind me of home even when home felt like a distant dream. And when the first letter came back, stamped and marked forward if known, I felt my stomach clench with that old fear of rejection. But then I saw Miss Betty's familiar handwriting peeking through, and tears blurred my vision. She told me she'd pray for me every Sunday, that she was proud I'd survived, and that I didn't have to face the world alone anymore if I learned to let in someone else's light. That was the moment my heart cracked open wider than it had in years, and for the first time since Mama walked away, I believed I could forge a life defined not by loss, but by the strength that comes from choosing to keep going. I realized that while I could not change the past, I could decide what kind of person I would become, and I chose to be someone who gave hugs to stray cats, who shared her last slice of pie, who refused to let cruelty dictate her story. In the hush that followed my escape, I found a new kind of silence, one rich with possibility, where grief and resilience sat side by side, and the echoes of that old chicken coop finally faded into a memory I could recount without my knees trembling. It was there, in the calm after the storm, that I discovered I was not the girl who needed saving, but the woman who learned how to save herself, and in doing so, discovered that sometimes the greatest healing comes in the spaces between heartache and hope. Land's sakes, I almost forgot how a single moment can bend the path you're walking until you find yourself stepping onto new ground you never dreamed of. It was early spring, the air still crisp but carrying whispers of green, and I had just finished my shift at the lumber mill, my hands calloused, but my spirit flat as the boards we hauled each day. I was walking home beneath a sky that threatened rain when I saw her, a little girl, no older than 7, sitting alone on the curb beside the church hall where I sometimes stopped to pray. She looked lost, her dress too light for the breeze, and her tears glittered on her cheeks like morning dew. I hesitated, remembering how long I'd carried my own silence, how I'd learned that strangers rarely stopped to help. But something in her sob caught in my throat, and before I knew it I was kneeling beside her, offering the hand I'd once used to gather eggs in the coop. "Hey now, sugar," I said, voice soft as a hymn. "What's got you so upset?" At first she stared at my rough palms as if they were exotic creatures. Then she slipped her tiny hand into mine and whispered that she'd run away from home because she thought no one cared whether she stayed or left. My heart twisted into knots I hadn't felt since I was her age, curling up in that dusty chicken yard, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell me I mattered. I scooped her into my arms and held her close, humming a lullaby Miss Betty once taught me, the same one I'd sung to myself when I feared I'd never be rescued from that coop. As I soothed her, I realized that all the strength I'd fought so hard to build for my own survival could be used to lift someone else's burden. The next day, I went to the pastor at that little white church and asked if there was a way to help. He smiled, surprised, and handed me a list: volunteer readers for the children's summer program, meals for the lonely, visits to families in need. And just like that, something bloomed inside me, a cautious but determined hope that maybe the world could be kinder than I'd learned to expect. My first step was simple. Every Tuesday afternoon, I sat under the oak tree at the church schoolhouse and read fairy tales to shy little faces, their eyes round as saucers, their smiles shy at first, then bright as sunlight. I watched them learn to trust me, to see that even someone with rough hands and a past full of pain could offer warmth and safety. I felt my own heart unfurl, petal by petal, as if I were learning to breathe again in a garden that had long forgotten me. That small act of kindness rippled outward. A neighbor asked if I'd help organize a food drive, another invited me to teach Sunday school, and before long I had a circle of friends who knew my name and my story, who didn't flinch when I mentioned the coop or my mother's silence. I began to believe that second chances weren't just for folks in storybooks, that they were as real as the rising sun or the first green shoot of spring. And baby, let me tell you, once you taste that kind of quiet purpose, you never want to go back to living for nothing but your own survival. I bought a new notebook and started writing down the tales of children I met, weaving in the lessons I'd learned under that crooked roof of feathers and straw, about endurance, forgiveness, and the bright spark that can ignite even in the darkest places. I sold a few of those stories to a small magazine and used the money to buy books for the church library, so another girl like me wouldn't have to wait nearly a decade to be handed her first copy of Alice in Wonderland. Each book I placed in a child's hands felt like I was returning a piece of my own lost childhood, mending the cracks one gentle page at a time. That simple act, helping a scared little girl on the curb, gave me back my faith in people and in myself. It reminded me that no matter how far you've been pushed out into the cold, there's always a warm light somewhere, waiting for you to step inside. And isn't that what a second chance is all about? Not erasing the scars, but choosing to share your strength so others can find their way home too. I reckon there came a day when I stood on my little porch in Missouri, the same one where I'd nursed my coffee each morning for the last 40 years, and felt the weight of all those chicken feathers and broken dreams lift off my shoulders like a soft breeze at last. I'd been tending my tomato plants, humming a hymn Miss Betty once taught me, when I realized I'd been carrying the pain of that old coop in my heart longer than I'd needed to. I'd never spoken the words aloud, but I'd held on to that tattered blanket I'd slept on for 9 years, rolling it up tight and burying it under my bed each night as if hiding it would hide the hurt too. But life's too short, baby, and I figured if I was going to spend my remaining days shucking off sorrow, I needed to do it proper. So I brought that blanket out to the back 40, where the wild blackberries grow, and I laid it across a fallen log. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of memories, the damp nights, the lonely clucks, the silent tears. I paused, closed my eyes, and let the Mississippi breeze ruffle my silver hair as I whispered, "I forgive you, Mama. I forgive myself." Then, with a deep breath that felt like the first real one I'd taken since I was 8, I set that blanket aflame in the old barrel we kept for burnin' brush. The flames curled up like a church steeple reaching for mercy, and the scent of wool and straw drifted into the twilight. Tears ran down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from release, from knowing that the past was finally free to rest in its own ashes instead of haunting me. When the last ember died, I looked up at the sky painted in lavender and gold and felt something stir in my soul, a steady, calm resolve that said I was no longer the girl who needed to prove her worth. I was Grace Eleanor, grandmother, friend, survivor, and I had chosen to live forward. That night, I penned a letter to my daughter, my dear, bright-eyed Ruth, explaining that I'd finally laid the past to rest, that I was whole again, and that she need never fear inheriting old wounds. I tucked the letter into a fresh envelope, sealed it with a tiny drop of wax I'd melted from a candle, and placed it on my kitchen table beside a vase of wildflowers. In the days that followed, I found myself laughing more freely, hugging my grandchildren tighter, and even humming a new tune in the mornings, one of hope instead of heartache. I offered a cozy quilt to a neighbor whose barn had burned, and I shared tomato preserves with everyone who knocked on my door, because I'd learned that kindness is the currency of a healed heart. And baby, let me tell you, making that choice, choosing to live without bitterness, without regrets, just onward, felt like stepping into sunlight after years in the shadows. I wasn't erasing my story. I was owning it, letting it shape me but not define me. So here I am now, 78 years young, planting seeds each spring and watching them grow, knowing that every blossom is a promise, that no matter how dark the coop may have been, a brighter morning always follows. I chose to let go, to forgive, and to step into the life I was always meant to live, and sugar, that's a decision I make anew every single day. I reckon after all those years of rattlin' around in that old chicken coop and wanderin' through lonely train yards, I've learned a truth that ain't fancy but sure is real. Life doesn't owe you kindness, but you can choose to be kind anyway. Back then, I thought my worth was tied to where I slept, to the silence I never broke, to the way folks judged me by the smell of feathers and straw. I believed that love was something you had to earn by staying small and quiet. But now I see how wrong I was. Land sakes, I wasted years waiting for someone else to hand me back my value, when all along I had the power to claim it for myself. Today, when I hug my grandchildren, run my fingers through fresh tomato leaves, or sit on my porch watching that Mississippi breeze tease the trees, I know that each of us carries within a spark no one can snuff out. No matter how dark the coop or how cold the world outside, I learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past or pretending wounds don't hurt. It's about freeing your own heart from carrying those wounds like stones in your pocket. When I let go of that threadbare blanket, burned in the twilight of my little back 40, I didn't just carve away a memory, I opened up room for joy in my soul. And baby, I want you to know that lesson too. You don't have to wait for an apology or a sign from heaven to heal. You can stand in the ashes of broken promises and decide right then and there that your life will be defined by hope, not hurt. I found out that true strength isn't measured by how much you can endure, but by how bravely you choose kindness after you've been wronged. I'll tell you what, there's a power in sharing your story, in speaking the truth of your scars instead of hiding them. When I sat under that oak tree each Tuesday and read fairy tales to those little ones, I saw their eyes light up, and I understood that my pain had value because it taught me empathy. It taught me how to reach out a steady hand to someone else who's trembling in the dark. So here's the real heart of it. Every chapter of your life, whether it's penned in straw and feathers or ink and paper, becomes a gift when you pass on its wisdom. It isn't about preaching or pointing fingers. It's about saying, I've walked this hard road, and you don't have to walk it alone. Maybe that's the reason I still plant tomatoes every spring, year after year. Because nurturing a tiny seed into a ripe, red fruit reminds me that growth takes time, patience, and a little faith. Folks say, don't count your chickens before they hatch, but I say, don't count yourself out before you've even started. If you feel stuck in a coop of your own making, whether it's fear, shame, or the echoes of someone else's harsh words, remember that the door's always there for you to open. It might creak and your knees might shake, but that first step into fresh air is yours to take. So perhaps it's time for you to stop living on borrowed hope and start believing in your own worth. Maybe it's time to burn those old blankets that hold you back, metaphorically speaking, or to reach out to someone who needs your hand. Because the truth is, we're all just folks trying to find our way home, and every act of courage, every moment of forgiveness, lights the path a little further. And child, if there's one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing my tale, it's this: don't wait for the world to set you free. Choose your own freedom today and watch how far you'll fly. Now, my dear friends, as we sit together on this little virtual porch where I've shared the dust and feathers of my past, I want you to know that this story isn't just a tale of childhood hardship or a lonely chicken coop. It's a living thread that stretches from then to now, through every kind word we offer and every silence we choose to break. I've walked you through the worry-filled nights when I learned to hide beneath that scratchy blanket, the first spark of hope when a boy named Tommy slipped me a story tucked inside his straw hat, the thunderous moment when Mama cast me out, and the long, quiet road I traveled to find myself again. And yet, here in the warmth of today, that story lives on each time I open my heart instead of closing it. I plant tomatoes in spring because I believe even the smallest seed deserves a chance to grow. I read to little ones under the oak tree because I know that stories can be lifelines. I forgive the past because I refuse to let its shadows dictate the brightness of my tomorrow. The truth I carry, a truth I hum quietly each morning as the sun peeks over those gentle hills, is that we are not defined by where we once slept, but by the hands we reach out to and the love we choose to believe in. And so I turn to you now, because what we've shared isn't a monologue, but a conversation, one that stretches across time and space from my world to yours. Do you ever find yourself waiting for someone or something to prove your worth? Do you doubt that kindness can bloom from pain, or that forgiveness can light the darkest night? Tell me, what do you think? Should true love always find its way back to those who wait with open hearts? I wonder, as I tend my garden and watch the breeze brush against the leaves, if Tommy's memory drifts back to that dusty yard where I first dared to dream. Sometimes I feel his laugh carried on the wind, a soft echo reminding me that the connections we forge in love, in friendship, in simple acts of grace, are stronger than any chain of hurt. And perhaps that is the gentle paradox I leave with you. Even as we carry the weight of old wounds, we also carry the capacity to heal, not just ourselves, but each other. So before we close this chapter, I invite you to carry one small seed of my lesson into your own life. Do not wait in the shadows of what's been done to you, but step into the light of what you can still give. Reach out to someone who may be sleeping in an invisible coop of their own making. Forgive a past that no longer serves your future. Share a story, a smile, or a warm blanket of words, and watch how tenderness can transform a hardened heart. And as for me, I'll keep tending my tomatoes, reading to those sweet faces under that oak, and listening for that distant laugh on the breeze, because even now, sometimes I think he still remembers, and in that hopeful whisper, I find the sweetest promise that love, once given, can always find its way home.